Okay, we've got one more panel. It's going to be an awesome one, actually. And then you've got lunch. So settle down, find your seats. And we're going to get started with the panel on the Great Reordering, which Christina very kindly named and asked me to lead. Let me just start while everybody's grabbing their seats. I'll start by framing this, and then I'm going to introduce our really terrific panel. When we talk about the Great Reordering, okay, zip, find seats. I'm going to be like my mother, the second grade school teacher. So when we talk about the Great Reordering, I'm going to go back to the pendulum analogy that Christina made at the very beginning when she was introducing this conference. I actually think about economic history and political economic history in general as a giant pendulum that swings. And political economy tends to be kind of purpose-built for its time. You know, you can go back hundreds and hundreds of years and say, you know, we had 18th century mercantilism, and that kind of worked until it didn't, and then we got laissez-faire, and then eventually you get too much of that, and you get the Great Depression, and then you need more government regulation, and then maybe by the 70s you have too much government and maybe too much red tape, and so then you get the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, and the animal spirits are released, and then we end up here 50 years later where there's perhaps too much animal spirits and too much concentration, and you get a system essentially in which capital has run farther ahead, way farther ahead than either goods or people. If you think about globalization as the free movement of capital, goods, and people, you could say that capital is moving well ahead of everybody else, which of course leads to the kind of corporate concentration and also in some senses concentration of state power in state-run economies that we've been talking about. So it's very clear to me as a journalist covering the political economy that we are at a pivot point. And I think that in the US, President Biden really summed this up incredibly well in his executive order, which has already been mentioned, talking about a shift from consumer to citizen, talking about privileging all aspects of the economy, all stakeholders, not just large companies, and really trying to push that out as a whole of government approach. We've talked about industrial policy, we've talked about trade, and I now want to get these wonderful panelists in, which I'm going to introduce very quickly, to kind of talk about what this means in practice, how the rubber's hitting the road, how's it changing how government is run. And we can dig into a few more of these topics as we go forward. So we are very, very privileged to have Rohit Chopra, who is the head of the CFPB and a good friend. We have Stephanie Van Korten. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Yep. Okay, great. Oh, sorry. And she is a member of the European Parliament, going to be talking a little bit about the European perspective. And we have Barry Lynn, who is the head of the Open Markets Institute, a good friend and one of the leading lights of the antitrust movement, particularly in the US. So, Rohit, I want to actually start with you, and I want to start with a conversation, just sort of an informal conversation, just to kind of stage set for your comments, that we had at a conference that Barry did in Washington. And you mentioned to me that you were looking, as a regulator, that you were often looking beyond the economics profession, beyond the experts, and I put them in quotation marks, and you were talking to journalists. You were talking to, you know, a lot of real people out in Main Street America to kind of figure out where to throw your energy. And it struck me, again, as someone that's covered all this for 3 decades, that was such a shift. I don't think I could go back 20 years in government and find someone in a position of power like yours that wasn't talking to just a handful of leading economists. You know, that would have been the conversation. So talk about why that's changed and maybe help people, particularly here in Europe, to understand that change at a really profound level.
Well, Rana, thanks so much for leading this. Let me share a couple of things. I think the pandemic is, of course, in such close memory, but I think for many people in the US and around the world, we also had another fairly recent crisis in the form of a global financial crisis in 2008, for which many of the standard experts really didn't predict. But actually on the ground, you saw people more focused on reality over models, experience over, theory. And I think many of that was completely predictable, and it animated a really gross failure by both the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Reserve Board in the US, that was unable to prevent such a harsh and painful financial reality. So as we take a step back and think to ourselves, there are so many places in which the apparatus has failed us. And what do we do to stitch together a new way of approaching policy making that in some ways rejects a very incumbent focused approach, both in financial regulation, in intellectual property, in trade, and so much more. So I think in some ways we're more than pivoting. The president here has already ordered all of us to really come up with this all of government approach to grow the economy in a fundamentally different way. And I think Ambassador Tai spoke to some of this. And that's a really different approach that I think is not going to be turned back. I think you see across the ideological spectrum a growing consensus on the long-standing failures in our agencies and really needing to reinvent a playbook. And now we're executing on that.
That I think that's a really important point, and I want to just amplify this. This is not a one president shift. This is not a, we're going to go back to the business as usual in over the next 4 years shift, no matter who wins the election. This is a really profound shift, and in some ways on both sides of the aisle, particularly amongst younger people in government that are coming up and just, no matter what their political perspective, just see these problems in a fundamentally different way. Before we come back to you, let me move on to Stephanie for a minute. And Stephanie, talk a little bit about how you hear all this from a European perspective. What do you hear? What makes sense? What doesn't?
Well, first, thank you for having me, and thanks a lot to Christina for this stunning time all together. Well, here in the EU, since we are ending the European mandate in, let's say, 3 months, I'd like to recall something back in 2019, just to set the scene. When I first arrived at the European Parliament, and I had to deal with my first European competition report, at this time, competition policy and law was a bit like me today, not that healthy, let's say woozy, with flu-like symptoms, like a isolated virus somehow, and fever when it comes to address industrial policy. This was really stunning. And so came, really, in 2019, the big shift, came the new, let's say, medical team with doctors Ursula, Margrethe, Thierry, and doctors MEPs. You probably heard about Andreas Schwab, René Ripasi earlier on, and maybe I should include myself. We all together decided to write a joint medical ordinance, a joint medical prescription. And we quite soon witnessed the effects of that. We could maybe call that the Great Renewing or the Brussels effect. But then suddenly I think we managed to see at the heart of that something that Reit said was the big shift in policies and the two good news coming soon from this medical team where, well, for the first time, competition policy and industrial policy are compatible. That's good news. And self-flagellation was over in Europe, I think for the first time. And I think this is very important, these key factors. And why that? Because I think it's quite aligned with maybe you're quite witnessing in the US, you know. We did a whole checkup and we took stock of what was going on, what was going bad, and some speakers already mentioned that some companies had more powers than member states. So this was as a wake-up call, and Apple, Microsoft with a market value of more than $3 trillion and still in Europe, fearing creating European champions. Also the data, this gold of the economy. Thank you, thanks, Barry. And you know, this question of getting bigger and bigger and data monopoly, which was the big concern. So all these things, together with what Rit called the wake-up call with all this crisis, for us, COVID, also the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the IRA. All these events came for EU as a shock, as a wake-up call to just say that, look, as I said, self-flagellation is over. A new order is coming. We are quite renewing the way we see policies, interaction between policies, also our competition concerns and concepts are dated. I think this is very important as well. I mean, it's not a bad word now to speak about innovation, about potential global competition. This is a starting point of the treatment, let's say. And if we also look at EU's future connectivity needs in terms of infrastructure investment as well, I think we need to revise the competition policy for the telecom market, and we need to engage in a better integrated single market. DG competition will certainly say that it's not competition matter, but more a regulatory problem. But I think we need to think that where we need to carry on working, advancing all together, and taking into account this big shift, big step. So, as I said, since 2019, big change.
Big changes. Okay, so Barry, I want to move on to you because you've driven a lot of the big changes. Your book, your first book, actually, The End of the Line, which came out in 2005, is that right? Really kind of predicted the supply chain crisis. Is still required reading for anybody that wants to understand that. Your next books looked at concentration of power, really kind of helped develop some of the framework that I think this administration is using. Where you've really been at the forefront of the antitrust conversation and then connecting it now with other areas of policy. Where are we going in the next 5 years, do you think?
I mean, that's a great provocation. And actually, it sort of fits into something that I had at dinner last night. I was talking to Rene Rapasi. And he said, Barry, you need to say what the American officials can't say. You know, and so what have the American officials, who've been here, and actually Catherine Tai got very close to this, but we have a spectacular opportunity to put into place, beginning in 2025, a next world system, one that increases radically human liberty, true democracy, deep security, real peace, and the kind of innovation that will help us fight climate change. We can have the open and cooperative international liberal world that we have dreamed of for 400 years. But we can do this only if we admit honestly that the world today is on fire, that the monopoly platforms are choking human autonomy today. They are crushing the free press today. They're amplifying the disinformation that is subverting our democracies today. That the concentrations of capacity that we see in places like China and Taiwan threaten not only catastrophic breakdown, but conflict and war. Luigi reminded us earlier of the lessons of the 1930s, which is that the monopolies supported the fascists and the fascists exploited the monopolies. And so, again, today, as bad, the monopoly unleashes a hubris, an appetite that destroys trustworthy information, the kind of information we need to run the world. We can achieve these opportunities only, also, and this is the key thing for Europe, only if Europe steps up with a vision of how to address these threats, all of them. There is a great vacuum in the world, and that vacuum is here in Europe. You look at the actions of the United States and China, the industrial policies of the United States and China, their trade policies, and you step backwards fearfully. You clutch your processes as a dowager clutches her pearls. The absence of a European vision increases the threat that we will fail to seize these opportunities, and it increases the threat of conflict far worse than the kind of conflicts we see today. Jake Sullivan last April 27th, and again in Davos, as we've heard, Catherine Tai on June 15th, and actually again here today, they proposed visions of a new world system. Where is your answer? Where is your conversation to develop an answer? You know, I understand. The specter of the presidential election in the United States is paralyzing. Hence, your plan A is to batten down the hatches. It's to get ready to slam the door shut. That's understandable. I understand it. But where is your plan B? Your plan for when President Biden wins 4 more years in power, in the White House, as is likely to happen. That is likely to happen. That is likely what we're going to see in 2025. So how do you meet these ideas of Sullivan and Tai and of President Biden in a way that embraces and improves and achieves their vision? You know, President Truman and General Marshall in 1949, they needed a partner. Jean Monnet stepped forward, and the result was Europe's first anti-monopoly law, which is called the Coal and Steel Agreement, which is now the foundation of the European Union. So who is your Monet today? I think actually in this room we have a few people who together shall do that.
Woohoo, call to action by Barry Lynn. Get on it, Europeans. Okay, Rohit, I have to come back to you because you're always talking about power. You are always talking, you know, we've had this conversation and you've made the point, which I think is totally true, that statecraft, market making, this is all about power. I wonder if you could, expand on that, amplify, and also get into a little bit about how you're thinking about it in the particular lanes that you swim in with finance, with pricing, with the way in which fintech has grown into this crazy behemoth. You know, now AI turbocharged. How are you putting into practice some of the ideas that we've been hearing about all day?
Well, certainly a big reflection of the past 40 years was really a learned helplessness by so many regulators around the world, where they thought markets were just happening in a, poof. Things happened and regulators watched from the sidelines. The reality is that many times these markets are absolutely the result, or at least shaped in terms of rules about how those market participants will compete. So I think the private sector should want the government to be actively involved in making sure it is a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. that it is meaningful innovation, not fake, fraudulent innovation, that it's human improving and not just beneficial to a click at the top. So the way I think about this, Rana, is we really have a big, big problem ahead of us, which is we know you talked about supply chains being so interconnected and fragile. We know the financial system, one player, and we were all worried about this, Credit Suisse or Silicon Valley Bank toppling the entire system. We now have the entry of very large tech conglomerates into finance in ways that I think is a pivotal moment for every central banker and financial regulator. We know that Libra, Facebook's failed experiment to create a new global currency, showed that central banks and regulators around the world were unprepared. Now, fortunately, Facebook failed, but we now have new ways in which big tech companies want to create currencies or payment systems that raise enormous questions about national security and the future of the financial system. We have seen in China, WeChat Pay, Alipay now deeply embedded throughout the Chinese economy with many tech conglomerates around the world looking to copy their playbook. Now, we could do the same thing that financial regulators and competition enforcers did in the past, which is to watch from the sidelines and do nothing except study it for 10 years. Or we can bring in what are our values of what we want to ensure occurs. We have a view that the financial system is not just to serve Wall Street, but to serve the entire economy. Our money and payment systems is a critical part of our state. And so it is incumbent upon us, Rana, that as we see big tech firms and others continue to expand their empires, that it is not for regulators to worship them, but for regulators to act. So we have lots of statutes on the books for decades, if not more, in the United States that you're seeing across the government we're putting to work to make sure that we are not passive and we actually execute upon the vision of the past, but also chart new rules for the future. And obviously, artificial intelligence is just another example of where we can decide to let a couple of inventors, many of them the same foundational models as large tech platforms, to throw their discoveries into the world and see what happens. Or we can do what we're doing in the US and have a agency by agency, sector by sector, and all of government approach to make sure that it doesn't turn into a disaster. So the answer, Rana, is about not being passive on the sidelines and simply watching until things really go off the rails.
Okay, we'll come back to you in just a minute, but Stephanie wants to jump in.
Yeah, well, two things. Echoing what Rohit has just said, I think on what we call desiloization is very important. Making sure that we, all embrace the same goal, objective, and there's no parallel actions to, for example, tackle the big techs and data monopoly. I think that's a crucial question that we all share, and that's all the most important, as Rohit mentioned, when it comes to AI. We don't want the GAFAM to replicate, their hyper dominance in AI, and that's what we are doing now at the European Parliament. If we want to reflect the reality of the digital markets now, we at the European Parliament are calling strongly the European Commission to consider personal data assets. in the same way as any other traditional sets when deciding on digital mergers and acquisitions, I think the Commission should be more, stricter on that. We also see in AI sector with cooperation agreements, all this data consolidation through mergers, acquisitions, they can really strengthen a dominant position. And it's going to be too late again to realize in 10 years after, we clear the kind of Google Fitbit acquisition, for instance. So that's a very, very big thing. And also, echoing what Barry said on Jean Monnet, I remember Jean Monnet, saying, I didn't get to know it myself, but he used to say, I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic, I am realistic. And I think the reality check of it, if we all want to share Jean Monnet's view, or at least be a small Jean Monnet's here, then I think we, in Europe, all these wake-up calls, and I mean, it's funny to see all these crises led to realize the hyper-dependency of Europe towards, other regions of the world, like China, for example. And it's funny to see how trendy it could be now to aim for Europe as a power. So, this is quite of a vision. Now, vision is not sufficient in itself, but since Barry's inviting us to have a vision, I think, Europe is, trying to lead that way. And also, it's funny also to see that now the European Commission in its latest communication on competition talk about the resilience of the internal markets. This also, I think, as an objective of the competition policy is quite a change of paradigm, I would say. So this is reality, and many occurrences show that we need to change when it comes to reindustrializing Europe, ensuring European sovereignty, and competition, of course, must be at the center of that, must be a tool, must not be a bad word, as we used to say, an isolated virus. And I think it's important to make it work and not anymore as an obstacle. And this all together with the twin transition make us, delivering a lot and switching from the Far West in 2019 to something more regulated at least. So I think we've got the vision all together, but we need to act now.
Barry, I want to bring you in because you have been, I think, always an Atlanticist and encouraged a lot of cooperation between the U.S. and the EU. It feels like the war in Gaza has sort of, turned everybody's head for the moment. There's a lot of folks in Washington, understandably, that are trying to, avert World War III right now. And so that the attention to things like some of the shared supply chain deals, clean steel, digital proposals that could be done jointly, it feels like some of that energy is missing. Do you agree with that? Where are the problems and challenges to getting that back on track, and where's the low-hanging fruit, do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. People today are distracted, and they're distracted for good reasons. These are huge crises. The leadership in the United States, leadership in Europe are spending a lot of time avoiding a conflict that is vastly worse than what we're seeing. And what is happening is that there has been sort of a setting aside of the work that was started in the United States under Biden in his first couple of years on supply chains. It's like there was some terrifically revolutionary actions, the IRA and the CHIPS Act, and a number of great executive orders, but we also actually have to step up the game. It's like we have stopped halfway through the process. We have left vast amounts of risk unaddressed. We have left great concentrations of power and capacity, sort of these choke points, unaddressed. And it's like these are threats to the stability of the entire system. These are threats to our sovereignty. And the thing is that these are threats that are easily fixed. These are machines that we can move around easily from one place to another. So it's like I think this issue of optimism, I've seen there's a lack of optimism that has been paralyzing people in Europe, but also it's true in America. And this is an age for, I will disagree with Monet slightly. The realistic, if you are a realist today, if you understand power, if you stare power in the face, and you actually pick up the tools to address power, then you should be a radical optimist, because we can fix every one of these problems.
Okay, Rahita, I want to come back to you, and I actually agree with Barry. I'm going to go on record and say I do think Biden's going to get another 4 years. 10 months is a long time, but the tailwinds are actually, I think, with him in a general. If that happens, what would your agenda be for the next 4 years? Where do you want to see progress? How are you going to continue sort of pushing this power, not just pricing paradigm, and really act on the EO?
Well, Rana, I think, let me give a very specific example, which is a problem that the US, Europe, really everyone around the world was dealing with, which was inflation. And the playbook that is typically used is a monetary policy tool, among others. There was obviously legislative activity in the IRA as well. But I think for the first time, you start to see that really classic toolkit in monetary policy being challenged in some ways by some very, very strange data where corporate profits were going up, and actually some analyses showing that that's actually contributing to the inflation, and it's begging the question about the role of competition in really making sure that there is price stability as well. When you see a restrictive monetary policy not necessarily solving how you think it would, that has really introduced another parameter for which needs a lot more thinking and probably action. We had a situation where the cost of diapers really went up in the US because one critical component, I believe some sort of pulp, there was supply chain issues, a shortage. And as that became available again, we did not see the price spike in diapers necessarily go down. And that's leading lots of people to wonder, is there excessive concentration at so many choke points? And of course, how the financial system interacts with that is a big question. The role of private equity in the US and the advanced economies, the role of very highly leveraged, too big to fail financial institutions. So we have a lot, as Ambassador Tai mentioned, to do to really recreate a system, institution by institution, market by market, and bring a real world lens on how we will fix it. Now, to answer your question more directly, you've raised the issue of artificial intelligence, AI. We know, I think both US and Europe realize we are lurching and creeping to a path where there are 3 or 4 foundational models that connect how our movements in electric cars, our geolocation is right now starting to affect whether we get a loan, or maybe what ad we're getting for a job listing. We have to make sure that excessive aggregation of data does not end up creating and undermining the core protections we give to our people in their spheres of life. And I think that's a real big ticket item for all of the regulators in the US to confront.
That's a great question. I mean, it really begs pretty profound issues of free will, actually. When you get to
and whether there's private governments. I mentioned earlier the idea of Facebook in 2019 creating a currency. This really was an astonishing move. that again failed. But now we see others trying to replicate that playbook, because if you can take that away from the public and or the state, boy, can you mint some real money out of that. And I think that that's really a way that challenged our ability to safeguard the core of our financial system and national security and our consumers.
Yeah, and you definitely made that point very publicly, as did SEC Chair Gensler. Just the idea that private companies could be in the business of creating their own currencies is a shocking thing. We have time for maybe one just kind of final thought from each of our participants. Stephanie, where do you think, assuming that there will continue to be work together with the EU and the US, where's the low-hanging fruit? What of all the things we've talked about, where can progress be made quickly in the next few years, do you think?
I think the EU has made a lot of progress and enacted historical regulations like DMA, for example, DSA, and I think in this way, if we want to to do things together, to cooperate more on this tech regulation, then I think the EU needs to deliver more, and I think we should consider maybe a global regulation altogether on tech giants. I think this is like AI. We will need to, I think, make some progress on that. Regional regulations on AI or tech giants cannot be sufficient, I think. And with the new AI market development, I think we will need to react quickly and take an active stance. And that's why also we need to make sure that AI is designated as a new core platform services, and we work together. We engage in parallel discussions and cooperation with the US. And more broadly, I think the reason why we need to improve and strengthen our internal market is not only because it's about resilience and sovereignty, but it's also a question of having a region of more than 450 million people and with millions of companies that can emerge and compete with the US in today's world. So I think this all together, I think all share some concerns in common, and I would say this is my main medical prescription for the next EU mandate. Well, so far, we don't know the medical team. It's still unknown in EU and in US. And I think that's the big question. Who will be the medical team in EU and in US for the following mandates? That's a big thing. But sure, in this uncertain world and times, we definitely need to make sure that on this, for example, digital matters regulation, we improve our cooperation and work all together, since it's a global concern.
Okay, very quickly, last thought, and then we'll give Heath the last word.
Yeah, now's the time for us to remember how to do something that we forgot how to do, which is to dream of a much better world. We haven't done this for a really long time. It's like neoliberalism it's not just a set of policies, it was actually a way of thinking. It was an ideology and a language that restricted how we see the world. One of the obvious intentions was to make it so we couldn't see power. But it also sort of brought back, fairies and all these pre-Enlightenment beliefs, like in the form of like magical markets and market forces. These are not things that exist in the real world. We got rid of this during the Enlightenment, So as we overthrow neoliberalism, we are restoring our ability to use common sense to see the world and to shape the world and to shape the world we want.
Okay, Rohit, final 1-minute thought is yours. What do you want Europe to take away from this conversation?
Well, I think that we all need the courage to learn. And I think that there was a really influential report a few years ago here in the US about antitrust and competition, and really the need to learn from the past mistakes and not cling to it as if it is sacred, but really to look forward and chart something very, very different and recognize that if we really want to save the ideals of democracy and a fair economy, we'll need to use a totally different playbook, and even one, Rana, that I think will be durable across different political cycles, because obviously the last era is over and we've now turned the page, and it's really an opportunity, of a generation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Thanks to the panelists. Lunch is served.